Alright, hey y'all. I'm excited about this because I'm going to be talking about Baudrillard's fourth book, The Mirror of Production, where he really digs his claws into Marx, but a little more specifically what people have done with Marx, which is much of a preamble or preface to the same kind of critique he levels against Foucault later in Forget Foucault. Now this book is funny for a number of reasons. First of all, the cover of the version I have is Marx, or a picture of Marx being crucified on a big cog, like it's something of like a factory type setting, I would assume, which I think is it's an appropriate cover for the project that Baudrillard undertakes here. Another thing that's funny about this, and this is revealed in the introduction by Mark Poster, is that as far as I know, this is the first instance that critics of Baudrillard have taken him to task for using quotes and stuff that they can't seem to find anywhere. They don't know where he gets them from. So when we get to those, I'll bring them up, and I've done my own research because it's one author specifically with one text. I haven't been able to find that stuff either, which is, it affected Baudrillard, how people read him, how he was received in the critical intellectual spheres, as not being a serious thinker, as being someone that didn't, abide by the proper regulations of intellectual, whatever, the rules that guide it, the unwritten codes or whatever. But in this case, it is a fairly well-written code that you have to cite things properly in order to be considered legitimate. So Baudrillard begins his book in the preface by stating, "A specter haunts the revolutionary imaginary," so clearly playing off of Marx and the Communist Manifesto. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism, that thing that's looming, the thing that's on that is inevitably going to reveal itself, but specters never reveal themselves in very obvious ways, which, thinking back to Marx, it would seem odd that he would use that analogy, because a specter only ever reveals itself, we think of the most kind of silly example where, like from Beetlejuice, with the ghosts with the sheets on them. The specter then is only constituted as a specter not by its physical embodiment of a certain space that that you can then see as being kind of taken off or mapped off due to the corporality of the specter, but by the specters being determined by the thing that covers it, the sheet in this instance, or the noises it makes, things that don't actually point to its being, with body, whatever that might mean. So in a sense, Marx was sort of predicting, communism, and even today, I think of like conferences, like Zizekian type conferences that, the hyper-realistic type, like communism exists in like certain spaces. You have to still abide by the certain like capitalist logic, because ultimately it's, something that can't be overthrown, if you will, something that can't totally be overhauled, so it has to exist only in these certain spheres. And I think that like the specter that makes noises in certain places or whatever, that only makes itself apparent in certain instances, so often at night, so often in the the Victorian mansion tormenting the nuclear family or whatever. But this specter for Baudrillard is not one of communism, but it's one of production, which is the basis for his whole argument, in that he doesn't feel that the revolutionary imagination as it has manifested itself in Marxism, critical theory more broadly, has not been able to capture the essence of a radical counter-discourse, hasn't been able to effectively grasp it. So he goes on to say that everywhere It, the revolutionary imaginary, the phantom of production, sustains an unbridled romanticism of productivity. The critical theory of the mode of production does not touch the principle of production. All the concepts it articulates describe only the dialectical and historical genealogy of the contents of production, leaving production as a form intact. So this is a difficult thing to swallow, even for myself. It does fail to get at or recognize the pragmatics associated or taken up via Marxist theory. And it comes out in all the, even if we think of Marxism in the most cynical, pessimistic way we can, we think of Soviet Russia or, like Khmer Rouge or whatever. There is, even though it can obviously manifest itself in awful, awful forms, it doesn't just, as Baudrillard states here, it doesn't just describe the dialectical and historical genealogy. There is something more to it, and that is something he addresses. But it's interesting that he disavows that right off the bat, because obviously, you had the Gulag Archipelago coming out like just a few years before this. All these, it was becoming world knowledge what exactly was going on. So then he goes on he pokes fun at the approaches that have sought to render productive modes of critical theory. So, for instance, the unconscious is surrounded in social, linguistic, and eatable structures. Let us give it back its brute energy. Let us restore it as a productive machine. And this machine, talk is a poke at Deleuze, of whom he says, from the liberation of productive forces and the unlimited textual productivity of tel quel to Deleuze's factory machine, productivity of the unconscious, including the labor of the unconscious. No revolution can take place itself under any other sign, in that productivity guides revolution, right? There must be a certain adoption of and this is a problematic conflation where Baudrillard, says that production and capitalism are two things that go hand in hand. Hence the title, the mirror of production. Whereas, I think a very clever Marxist person would say that no, if production doesn't occur if production is for the sake of a certain, profit motive, right? Because then production isn't for the sake of satisfying needs, right? It's creating them or whatever. You could insert the kind of scripted answer to that there, but it holds on nonetheless because Baudrillard is making a conflation here. But his point is interesting in that he says that everywhere productivist discourse reigns, whereas he sees the only possibility of there to be like something of a revolutionary turn, if we can possibly think of one in that way, or the approach to a radical theory, which is what I would argue his whole corpus is trying to develop, right, over the course of his however many 40 books, trying to develop something of a radical theory. It can't rely on the same capital P productivist type discourse, right, where we think, okay, in the 1950s Marxist camp, let's render, thinking of Marcuse, let's render the, unconscious productive. Or what Baudrillard says of Julia Kristeva, in one of his cool memories, he says that if there is a thing called the unconscious, as there is in Kristeva, there cannot be, it can't be be viewed as correlative to some kind of political force agenda aside, which in the case of Kristeva, which can be argued with Marcuse, the unconscious is suspiciously left-wing, and of course we could problematize that a little bit, thinking of like how Thanatos plays a certain role, but there's something to be said about how an unconscious somehow embodies left-wing politics, at least what he says of Kristeva, when in fact if there is something that's like an unconscious, if such a thing does exist, it surely does not lend itself to some sort of political analysis. In fact, it's something that transcends that, it's something that precedes it, it's something that doesn't have it's not the embodied manifestation of some sort of political discourse. So he goes on to remind us still in the preface here, the similar project he conducted for a critique of the political economy of the sign, in that an evaluation of signs, evaluation of signifiers, as opposed to thinking about things as having a fundamental, universal kind of use value, is lost in Marxist thought. There's a startling absence of an analysis of signs of signification, right? But there is an exegetical quality to it. Marx is not an incompetent, or was not an incompetent thinker. In fact, Marx was heavy-handed. He was someone that could, tear apart any sort of specific thing, right? And in that way, it can be read that he did, in a sense, kind of commit himself to the realm of signs, because dealing with like textual type arrangements, how do you possibly, get to suggest there to be like a bare bones type, like a real thing existing behind it? But I think Baudrillard makes a good point, and of course, for more on that, like his last book, which I did here, it explains that a little bit more. So that leads us into the first chapter. So what Baudrillard says right off the bat, all the fundamental concepts of Marxist analysis must be questioned, which is beyond fair. There are things about it that certainly need to be overhauled. And it strikes me as odd, because to this day, we think of Marx as being written so many years ago. There's still an odd move to apply his theory in ways that he has become, as though he hasn't become irrelevant or outdated, which makes me suspicious. And for Baudrillard to be saying this in like the early 70s, right? And you had Foucault saying something similar in the Order of Things. I can't remember this off the top of my head. He says in the Order of Things, Marxism in the 18th century is like a fish in the water. Like, it can't breathe anywhere else. Now that passage by Foucault essentially is what Baudrillard's doing here. And why is that? Like, what is it about Marxist theory that doesn't get at what's going on today? Where perhaps it had some, this sort of raw validity at one point, right? You're thinking of, the clear split between workers and the bourgeois, the aristocracy, or whatever, and how that kind of relationship played itself out, kind of lending itself to an easy kind of Hegelian dialectical scheme. But now, having all things kind of melt together, the distinction between worker and owner is much more difficult to ground, kind of throwing a wrench in the easy kind of dialectical drive between, or the movement between, like, slave and slave owner. How do we reconcile Marx in that today? What can we do with him? And people do it. I'm just suspicious of any such attempts to do such a thing. So he states of this that the liberation of productive forces is confused with the liberation of man. Right? And of course, we'll problematize this use of the word man, something that at least other French thinkers of the time, like Deleuze and Guattari, were certainly cognizant of. For Baudrillard, it doesn't matter, just using this term man, but it's that's for another talk. But for now, he then goes on to say, is this a revolutionary formula, or that of political economy itself? So is this equation of a certain liberation of the productive forces with the liberation of man, right? And again, I'm going to keep coming back to like Marcuse in the sense, right? Thinking about liberation of leaving more leisure hours for the individual is, in a sense, liberating human experience, as though that time is just magically going to be filled up with kind of non-productive yet productive in a certain creative capacity way, which is odd. It seems like an epistemic fallacy, right? Like a leap of faith. How do you possibly, think that doing one will lead to the other? it's there is certainly weight to it, but we have to be suspicious and we have to be careful. So what he then goes on to say is that almost no one had doubted such ultimate evidence, that, equating the two, liberation of one with the liberation of the other, especially not Marx, for whom men, and he's quoting Marx here, begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence. And then in quotes, not in quotes, in brackets, Baudrillard says, "Why must man's vocation always be to distinguish himself from animals? Humanism is an idée fixe, which also comes from political economy." In that, in Marx, there, what place do animals hold, right? As but then he says, of course, we don't really have time to talk about that now, which is fair, but animals don't fall under the same kind of criteria of labor. In fact, it's that lack of criteria, or lack of Dasein, if you will, that allows us to distinguish ourselves from them, in effect, giving ourselves an identity, right, as being separate from that, like the kind of Derridian type deferral, not I am what this is, I am what I am because I am not what that is, or so on and so forth, the endless trace, or the sequence that goes on for infinity. So what Marx did, and this is what Baudrillard identifies in him very roughly and very broadly, is that Marx deconstructed labor, or bifurcated labor into two broad camps, that is, exchange value, or what is called abstract social labor, and then concrete labor, use value. And the same formula can be applied to things as they exist, right? What value does a pendant have? It would fall under the camp of exchange value, right? In Marxist type analysis, whereas a shovel, would have a certain use value, or a pick, or a pickaxe, or whatever, in that it has a direct attachment to the earth, if you will. Like Arendtian toiling with the earth is homo faber, man using his hands, the big man who works. This idea kind of associated with the romanticizing one's relationship with earth, with labor, with power, in a sense, which runs through Marx, and there's a commitment to a certain productivity there, right? Even in the critique of it, ironically enough. So this loss of, at least coming into this capitalist mode of production, or what capitalism sort of sequesters, is the relationship between use value and its being useful, if you will, or things existing, or there being that very clear split between one thing and another, from exchange value to use value. In Marx is saying the capitalist mode of production, like if we think of like owning a business, right? Accumulate a certain degree of capital, profits, or whatever, go back in a certain percentage of the profits, or whatever, how that's calculated in a certain instance, is put back into the system, back into the business, back into this or that, used to improve certain things or whatever. And it keeps going on, and this cycle continues until, like, we think of, to butcher it a little bit, think of like the Barthian Argonauts, like the boat or the ship or whatever. To what point does the original sort of use of those things that make up that business start becoming more and more abstract, in that there's no real connection to the things being produced, but there's just that unyielding attention to the accumulation of capital, right, to use Luxemburg's terminology, where there's, things are only in the service of producing more capital, which in effect is recycled, at least a portion of it, back into the existence of the things that work to produce that capital, where it's not for the satisfaction of needs, but like this endless cycle, this perpetual cycle. So Marx identifying that happening in the capitalist mode of production, for Baudrillard, at least his romanticism of there being this kind of inherent use value that exists in the world. For Baudrillard, that what it does is it retains something, this is his words, retains something of the apparent movement of political economy the concrete positivity of use value, a kind of concrete antecedent within the structure of political economy, where we can, it's ironic, but in a sense, the secret logic to capitalism is that belief in the satisfaction of needs. So in a sense, Baudrillard is being kind of Hegelian about it. Like he doesn't want to undermine capitalism as having like no logic, right? Or those people caught under it having no systematic logic to it, or simply like this schizo type, that extremely problematic Deleuzean term, not being just being like an incoherent type mass, like this blob or this kind of free floating thing, right? So in that way, Baudrillard wants to think about there being like, people actually having needs satisfied through exchange value, right? It's not just use value that satisfies needs. Like, it's important to think about how people like live, how people experience their lives, not just in relation to the land, or they're like putting food from the earth into their mouths, right? To keep themselves alive, but how much more there is to the world. And how Marx, at least for Baudrillard, when Marx maintains that there is, a real form of use value, it's like taking capitalism to the nth power, right? Completing capitalism's project. At least that's in a sense what Baudrillard is trying to say here. So by relying in a sense on this mode of production, or on this transcendental sort of use value paradigm, Baudrillard says of Marx in this sentence, failing to conceive of a mode of social wealth other than that founded on labor and production, Marxism no longer furnishes in the long run a real alternative to capitalism. Sort of passive sentence. It's kind of annoying to read, but the point is that to what extent, or Baudrillard's trying to say, to what extent does Marx rely on some underlying themes or ideas apparent in capitalism in order to push his own analysis, in order to develop his own theory? And in that sense, to what extent does it just mirror it? Does it just replicate it? So what is oppressive, at least for Baudrillard here, is that under political economy, right, under the capitalist mode of production, which should be something I should have clarified earlier, is not something he celebrates. He is not at all in favor of capitalist expansion. And this, I will digress momentarily. There are people who read in Baudrillard a sort of accelerationist type politics, which would be one of the most incorrect things I've ever heard. Not to say that you can't dig out certain passages that would advocate for a coming to an end. But I think Baudrillard is very conservative. There's no denying this. Baudrillard doesn't have, he's not interested in accommodating a sort of left-wing political framework. Kind of. He does, he's very critical of, at the time of Le Pen. He does have many writings on politics, the political stuff going on at the time, and he is by no means someone who falls under the camp of the right or the camp of the left per se. He was the thinker of radical theories that don't align with political thought, which is fair, but in that way he saw that the only real end to like this sort of system, it doesn't come out in the form of Marxism or any sort of critical theory, but is through an implosion, in a sense, or a total destruction of the system, which isn't something he necessarily called for per se, but it's something that he said is kind of the only way we'll get out of it, right? And that shouldn't undermine like current political efforts, because he has these odd moments when he says something like graffiti is a mode of resistance, right? Or art more generally can occupy that or perform that function. or he says of Hendrix, like Hendrix's version of the Star-Spangled Banner. It's one of those kind of resistive practices, which isn't to say that these things don't exist, right? What ends they serve, like perhaps Baudrillard just wants us, and we could read a method take his methodology from here and say, like, okay, in my sort of resistive practices, or whatever I'd conceive to be, if I conceive them to be as such, to what extent do they work within the system itself, and to what extent do they actually resist it, and not just kind of duplicate that which I'm trying to criticize. So, to return, thinking about social labor, or not social labor, thinking of political economy, he says that, and Marx's kind of attribution of a certain value to use value, he says that the system of political economy does not produce only the individual as labor power that is sold and exchanged. It produces the very conception of labor power as the fundamental human potential, or as being that thing that, with enough of it. And, of course, how Marx was taken up in the 50s, right? It's like, you can't abolish labor power completely, but it's about labor power being its most productive, maximizing output, minimizing input, if you will, reducing the working hours and all this, which is just it's just, to me, just how do we maximize or potentiate human ability. Like, it sounds a lot like, small business type, small, medium, large business, all business type rhetoric. Like, just simply a pure mirror of that. How do you possibly, suggest such a thing, supporting a certain degree of, if you adopt like a Marxist method, saying like we're going to reduce the labor hours and people are going to work only the right amount that we need in order to satisfy all the basic needs and some, because basic needs suck, right? Basic needs is just like what the stuff that people spend. You spend most of your day starving. Not to say that that is what necessarily occurred, or is occurring today in countries that identify as Marxist. But thinking about Marx in these terms, it's difficult to kind of ascertain a universal basic needs or basic requirements. What do those look like? People don't have one set of needs, especially if we take Baudrillard seriously and thinking about exchange value, thinking about things not just in their use value as being things that are fundamentally meaningful to people, and this is a scary word for some Marxist thinkers, but thinking of culture, thinking of difference, people can't be kind of put under the same rubric, can't be put under the same, can't be quantified in that way. So it is in this way, and then what Baudrillard says is that Marxism assists the cunning of capital. It convinces men that they are alienated by the sale of their labor power, thus censoring the much more radical hypothesis that they might be alienated as labor power, as the inalienable power of creating value by their labor, right? And that's only duplicated in Marx, right? Thinking about what I just said about there being the right amount of labor, there being the correct way to conduct labor, not actually critiquing labor or challenging it per se, but just making it better, making labor more productive in a sense, making labor serve more of the interest of labor itself. So it is in this sense that needs and labor work hand in hand, where they affirm one another, where labor, having become so ingrained in our very logic and having become indicative, if we accept Baudrillard's hypothesis, of labor's antithesis, i.e. Marxism or communism, then it is our ontology, if you will. It is that thing that guides us, that gives us, that essentially creates our characters. So how do needs then sprout out up differently from that, right? And this is Marx's project as well, thinking of like the superstructure and base. Like, the economic system on which the superstructure lies defines superstructure. It sends its tentacles up through it, essentially, determining what is going to go on there, how people are going to engage with one another, how people are going to exist, how people are going to live, so on and so forth. But for Baudrillard, that doesn't go away with communism, doesn't go away with a system that relies so heavily on there being a proper use to production or value. So labor in conducting or determining how humans exist, how they experience the world, of this Baudrillard says that labor alone founds the world as objective and man as historical, especially if we accept the dialectical kind of movement throughout across history, right, arriving at this point, which are terms that are very pernicious, right, in Baudrillard's work. Thinking of history or objectivity are things that are characteristically absurd, right? History is something for Baudrillard that has always been a simulation, right? History, and he says that one of his later texts, the specific one eludes me, but he says that history is granted only to a certain group of people, right? European, Western type people who have this sort of, that fetishize history, that fetishize there being a before, now, and afterwards, this sort of progression, this teleological movement that is only affirmed when Marxism claims, locates this a fundamental use value, or affirms this kind of objectivity of the world, which is, highly Eurocentric. And it would be, and Baudrillard will come to do this, but thinking about things in epistemologically different terms. How do things change across cultural boundaries, social, political boundaries? How do we view the world differently depending on where we are? Where we can't just simply say, under this banner of scientific socialism, this Luxemburgian and Marxian type rhetoric, there being like the objective world. This objective world can be manipulated in a certain way, right? We can extract the exact number of resources from it, and so on and so forth. That for Baudrillard just, reaffirms the notion of there being this kind of individual human being that is different from others, from other species in the world, that has this sort of connection to the world that renders them transcended, that shows that they can be other than, those things that just occupied the world. So Baudrillard, in order to do this, he quotes one passage from Marx that goes as follows. In the last analysis, the burdensome character of labor expresses nothing other than a negativity rooted in the very essence of human existence. Man can achieve his own self only by passing through otherness, by passing through externalization and alienation, of which Baudrillard says that this passage, it shows how the Marxist dialectic, in his words, can lead to the purest Christian ethic, or an idea that I this is kind of my own research, is thinking about how Marx, at least how it's taken up in post-human strands and the kind of Deleuzian type camps, not necessarily Deleuze and Guattari themselves, but how they're taken up. How Marx it reaffirms capital's global reach, right, by saying that, there is a fundamental set of human needs that can be satisfied, and how if, you're not with us, you're against us type logic that is there. And we will get more into that as we go along here. So even that thing that stands opposed to labor, and this is where Baudrillard brings up Marcuse specifically, where he says of Marcuse, who returns to the less puritanical, in brackets, less Hegelian conceptions, which, however, are totally philosophical, in brackets, Schiller's aesthetic philosophy, Marcuse, who says that play and display, as principles of civilization, imply not the transformation of labor, but its complete subordination to the freely evolving potentialities of man and nature. So Baudrillard responds to that in an interesting way. He says, this realm beyond political economy called play, or that thing that stands outside of political economy, that sort of resistive, naturally resistive kind of potential, however it might look, right? Whatever play is for one person, doesn't occupy that same kind of place. But he says that this realm beyond political economy called play, non-work, or non-alienated labor, is defined as the reign of a finality without end. In this sense, it is and remains an aesthetic, in the extremely Kantian sense, with all the bourgeois ideological connotations which that implies. So although Marx's thought settled accounts with bourgeois morality, it remains defenseless before its aesthetic, without ambiguity, is more subtle, but whose complicity with the general system of political economy is just as profound. So in a sense, Marx, at least how it's taken up Marcuse, maintains there to be this sort of distinction, right? Kind of romanticizing this notion of play, where either Marx is, enmeshed in those, this is Baudrillard here, in those concrete finalities of use value, or those endless ideal and transcendent finalities. He's caught in either or. He belongs to one camp, or maybe not either or, but at least establishing there to be those two camps. And with this, we just end up, we remain within the kind of bourgeois problem of freedom of, recreation of play, or in Baudrillard's words, the double ideological expression which has been the institution of a reality principle, that is repression and sublimation, or the principle of labor, and its formal overcoming in an ideal transcendence, or play, or non-work, or whatever. So work and non-work here is a revolutionary theme, just by being not work, which, if we maintain this sort of, bi-univocal type split, where one determines the other, just engaging with one does not destabilize the other. In fact, it affirms it. By being in one camp, you're saying that, okay, I am in this camp that stands opposed to that, and the only reason this camp has validity as this camp or of this side is precisely because it is not that other thing that must be there in order to maintain, in order to, mirror, if you will, that initial camp, or whatever camp you happen to be in. So in a sense, Marx failed to see a whole slew of other things going on. To just name a few that Baudrillard brings up, he says there was discharge, waste, sacrifice. Sacrifice is a big one, and that's something we'll come back to in his Symbolic Exchange and Death, what role sacrifice plays in political economy, or in economy generally, if I can, subsume cultures that engage in explicit forms of sacrifice. And I say that in quotes because I it's not like every culture has ever engaged in sacrifice in the same ways, but how that serves as sort of, in quotes, economic type function, when it's just, something that happens there, and economy is really just an esoteric term that is not as universal as we might think. But again, I digress. We have sacrifice, we have prodigality, play, and symbolism. These are all terms that eluded Marx. So social wealth for Marx always has to do with material, right? That's the dialectical materialism, things that exist in the world, like the table, like the chair, whatever, and what role they serve, kind of leaving behind those other factors that determine people's existence, that give people meaning, so on and so forth. So in just the ways that Marx does touch on those terms, right? See, of course that they're there, but the way he engages with them, and the example that Baudrillard gives is in the example of discharge, which isn't to be thought of in relation to bataille, right? Or what's the accursed share, or whatever, the thing that's left on the mattress after intercourse. But discharge for Marx, at least according to Baudrillard, is still an economic, productive, finalized discharge, precisely because in its mating with the other, it begets a productive force called the earth, or matter, reaffirms that there being such a thing that can be seen as such. So to move away from thinking about things just in terms of like use value and exchange value. Baudrillard says that Marxism relies on, historical materialism, dialectics, modes of production, labor power. And he says through these concepts, Marxist theory has sought to shatter the abstract universality of the concepts of bourgeois thought. That is, nature and progress, man and reason, formal logic, work exchange, kind of the project of like the humanities or whatever, kind of tearing apart these traditional splits. Yet, for Baudrillard, Marxism in turn universalizes them with a critical imperialism as ferocious as the others, right? And I was getting at this with this, how Marxism does rely on a sort of universalization, right? And that isn't just in the service of basic human needs, but it extends into those, what I will reluctantly call kind of the higher faculties, in quotes, thinking about, art, literature, science, reason, whatever, all these things that permeate through Marxist thought. And we're going to get into this more, but Marx is thinking about like pre-industrial people. What do they look like? What do other cultures look like to Marx? And so in Marx, history is, for what Baudrillard sees in it, it's transhistorical. It redoubles on itself, and is thus universalized, because it is the absolute be-all, end-all, if you will. It is the thing that, in the time of Marx, it was inevitable, right? There was no way to think about the progression of history other than in terms of arriving at communism, if you will. Whether it was through reform or revolution, right? It was going to be inevitable, but of course that we didn't see that occur per se. But with that, there is the articulation of history as being this teleological thing that moves left to right or whatever, moves through time linearly, which is it's not something that is just held like universally. Like that's a very, I don't want to say privilege, because it's not like people necessarily benefit just by thinking that. There are the things that come along with it, but it does affirm a sort of, privileging of one mode of being. That being said, a very easy one to digest, thinking about things in terms of linear movement, which is, perhaps the easiest way to engage with the world. So in doing so, they set themselves up in expressing, in quotes, an objective reality. They become signs, for Baudrillard, signifiers of a real signified, or the missionaries of materialism, dialectical materialism. And he goes on to say, and though at the best of times these concepts have been practiced as concepts without taking themselves for reality, they have nonetheless subsequently fallen into the imaginary of the sign, or the sphere of truth. They are no longer in the sphere of interpretation, but enter that of repressive simulation, which is an extremely important point. And I say this often, but it's one that we'll get to in his later texts. But to kind of preface what I'll eventually do, simulation is not the opposite of reality. Simulation is what can often feed into reality. Simulation often plays with reality. Reality being, like in this context, that identification of an objective real world. So in that sense, it's a repressive simulation, because once things are simulated, they're grounded in a sense. I simulate a thing, and that thing is then frozen in time. It's given an essence through its image. Its image then comes to replace the thing itself, which is always, for Baudrillard, susceptible to change across, boundaries, across time. As time moves left, right, up, and down, however which way it moves, it will be susceptible to change. Whereas in simulation, things are, or in repressive simulation, because I shouldn't say that there's just one brand of simulation. In repressive simulation, things are given that essence. So he then says that the scientific and universalist discourse, in brackets code. So here's probably one of the closest things to a definition of the term code we get in Baudrillard. Scientific and universalist discourse. That's the code, the thing he's trying to smash, right? So this immediately becomes imperialistic, in that if you don't abide by it, like you are then seen as being, you don't belong to the proper scheme or whatever. Then says that all possible societies are called on to respond. That is, consult Marxist thought to see if societies, in quotes, without history, are something other than, in quotes, pre-historical other than a chrysalis or larva. Or how do you fare? Like, what kind of use do you have if you don't fall under the banner of this sort of system in ways that we might traditionally understand it? Whereas for Baudrillard, there is neither a mode of production nor production in primitive societies. There is no dialectical and no unconscious in primitive societies. These concepts analyze only our own societies, which are ruled by political economy. So in a sense, we can apply these sort of methods we've developed and apply them to ourselves, right? Because we are guided by these frameworks. But it's as soon as we think that, it's universal, it can be applied to anyone, and the same applies like psychoanalysis. Like, how does psychoanalysis work across boundaries? And the fact that Baudrillard does this kind of project, and in this section, it's just titled like epistemology. This is the thing that Deleuze and Guattari are kind of resistant of in Anti-Oedipus. They say like, it'd be almost all too easy to apply some epistemological analytic to try and like destabilize this kind of Oedipal fantasy, right? Because it would be, and there's nothing wrong with doing it. Like it absolutely gets the point across, and it's something that Baudrillard takes up here. So then Baudrillard, because you don't want to just be the person that critiques everything, Baudrillard proposes that in view of Marx's theory of use value or exchange value, we need to start to think about things in terms of a symbolic exchange, which we can criticize the hell out of, because on one end you have Baudrillard saying that Marx is just mobilizing or rendering productive those elements that are viewed as being non-productive under capitalism. But then here we have Baudrillard using this thing called symbolic exchange that has some odd affinity with, like, in quotes his terms, like primitive people, which is very problematic, and it's not something we can forgive him for, but alas, we're left with this term to deal with it. And it's something he did only later on in like 87. He says that, yeah, I'm sorry I did that was not a good move. But he says that we must propose something radically different, and for him that is symbolic exchange, or what that might look like. So Baudrillard takes this point to end off his chapter here, coming around full circle, where he says that this, just as Marx thought it necessary to clear the path to the critique of political economy with a critique of the philosophy of the law, the preliminary to this radical change of terrain, that is, the one to symbolic exchange, is the critique of the metaphysic of the signifier and the code in all its current ideological extent. And he says, for lack of a better term, we call this the critique of the political economy of the sign. In the sense, now he's beginning to employ that, I guess, his methodological approach, that thing that he kind of worked towards for a critique of the political economy of the sign, thinking about things in radically different terms. Now, whether we can interrogate to what extent, they embody an actual degree of radicality, or if they in themselves just mirror the same sort of systemic modes of oppression that Baudrillard claims to move away from, is certainly something we could do. But for now, and this is the end of his chapter here, we'll leave it at that. And for anyone that made it this long, thank you for listening, and I hope that you can get something out of this. I really enjoy this text, and I've only gotten through it once before. Now this is only the second time I've revisited it, but it's something it's not an easy text. It's certainly difficult to get at the nuances of Baudrillard's critique of Marx, because they are complicated, and my own relationship with Marx isn't as strong as it could be. So I try to, coming at this I try to be a little bit careful because, I don't want to take Marx out of context, and I don't believe that Baudrillard does here, but there are certainly things to be said about the points that Baudrillard may miss. But next time we'll go over the following chapter, and we'll go and see what Baudrillard has to say about like the epistemological implications of Marxist thought or the possible violence it commits. But for now, for anyone who made it this far, thank you for listening, and if you got any problems, any beef, you know how to leave it. Thanks. Bye.